Our presenter tonight is DJ Thompson. She is a consultant senior manager at the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits. She's certified in nonprofit management and also teaches their standards for excellence, which I definitely encourage any board you're involved with to check into, because it gives you I think the best overall review of all of the basic board practices that boards need to be best in class. What I liked about DJ's bio is that she is a graduate of both Leadership Oklahoma City and Leadership Muskogee. So she shares our commitment to community. And so I'm going to turn it over to DJ. I'm going to mute myself unless I have a comment here or there. So welcome and thanks for being here tonight.
Hey, thank you, Wendy. I appreciate that. And thank you everyone for having me. As we've already experienced, we may have a couple of glitches in the tech. Hopefully we're all used to that by now. I apologize if it's on my end. I will jump as soon as I can. But thank you. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I am in Oklahoma City this evening. And as Wendy mentioned, I did a 10-year stint in the Muskogee area. And my husband had moved up there to take a position. We were there for 10 years and we moved back about a year and a half ago. So I've been with the Center for Nonprofits since then. Okay. I got a message that said my internet connection is a little unstable. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And then what I'm going to do is just turn my camera off. So I think that usually helps my internet just a little bit, my bandwidth. So I'm going to do that. And Wendy, you're going to monitor the chat for me. So since we are a small group, I would love for you just to jump in with questions anytime. Just take yourself off mute and we'll just jump in and discuss as we go. There's no reason to wait till the end. So feel free to do that. We're super casual tonight. We're having Monday night fun, right? So that'll be just great. Okay. So can everybody see my screen? Good. Okay, so I'm going to turn my camera off just for purposes of helping, and I may, pop it back on here and there. Okay, so we are going to talk about nonprofits and politics, right? And specifically lobbying, advocacy, political campaigns. Sometimes you'll hear it called electioneering, and we're going to use that term quite a bit this evening as well. We've already met. My name is DJ Thompson. And my bio is on our website if you'd like it, and I'd be happy to tell you anything you'd like about me. Probably the most important thing to know, other than I do have two beautiful daughters that are grown and not in the house, is that I am an animal lover, and I do have 3 dogs in the house, 3 rescues, and one is in here with me. You may hear him from time to time. So if you hear weird noises, it's him in the background yawning or to tell me that it's dinner time, or he doesn't like me talking to other people. He needs my attention. So that's probably the most important thing to know about me. But let's talk a little bit about our agenda for this evening is electioneering and, like we said, political activity for nonprofits. And we're going to talk a lot about what is allowed, what is not allowed. We're going to talk about lobbying and advocacy, and a little bit about the differences and what is allowed there as well. And then how to prepare, plan, and prevent, and what some of the best practices are around all of these topics to help mitigate risk and to protect your nonprofit. So the first slide that I show you is just a little bit of a representation of what's okay and what's not. And I'll just tell you, I've already mentioned my dogs. I picked Lincoln and Truman. You'll see the pictures there because those are my 2 male dogs' names. We name our animals after presidents around here. My daughter's name is Hoover. My daughter's dog's name is Hoover. My daughter's name is Reagan. She wasn't really named after the president. So we started kind of a trend, but that's the reason I picked those 2. But when it comes to political process, charitable organizations, 501c3s specific, also 4s and 6s, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the differences in those in case you're interested. But 501c3 specifically, and any nonprofit, are subject to a lot of very specific restrictions on their involvement in campaigns and in electioneering and political intervention. So understanding what is acceptable and what is prohibited is really important, especially during election seasons and election years. And we know just from last year's election that things have heated up and changed pretty dramatically, especially with the use of social media and outlets that we didn't used to have and didn't used to be able to use when we were talking politics. So it's a lot easier to share our opinions and to see other people's opinions. And so we have to be pretty cognizant of that if we're involved with a nonprofit at all, and that includes being on the board. So if you're a board member of a nonprofit, you have to be careful as well. It's not employees, and we'll talk about that specifically in just a few minutes. So also understanding the distinctions between permitted activities. So the distinctions between electioneering and lobbying versus prohibited actions of political intervention, for example, are pretty important. So nonprofits, as I mentioned, can be very different. There are several different numbers of 501c's. 501c3s are the most common and probably the most common that you deal with. But for example, Leadership Tulsa is probably, Wendy, a C4 or C6?
Actually, we are C3.
Oh, you're a C3. Okay.
Yeah, we're
okay.
independent of our Chamber of Commerce, and we do have our C3.
Okay. Yeah. So, so chambers of commerce, for example, are probably the most common C6 that you are familiar with. There's a lot of membership organizations are C6s. Associations, a lot of times, are C4s. So your state associations of, whatever professional group or something like that. So it's important to know what your designation is when it comes to electioneering and political intervention, because there's different levels of allowance with those, because C4s and C6s and even C5s are set up a lot of times so that they can do more lobbying or more political intervention. So C3s, on the other hand, have very, very little allowance for any kind of electioneering. So just knowing that difference is pretty important. So knowing which boards you're on, what their C3C status is with the IRS can be relevant. So the focus of our training, as I mentioned, is understanding and distinguishing between acceptable and prohibited electioneering activities, and then also talking about lobbying and advocacy and what's important there. We'll also discuss the penalties if a nonprofit or its fiduciaries do get involved in improper involvement in political activities. So we'll touch on that just a little bit. So what is electioneering? Electioneering and political intervention are a lot of times used interchangeably, but there's the definitions. I don't need to read them necessarily that specifically to you, but it's essentially anytime you participation in a campaign of any kind on behalf or even in opposition to any candidate that's running for public office. And likewise, political intervention can also be called electioneering, is the same thing. So it's working for the success of a particular candidate, party, the ticket, whatever it may be. So when we're talking about a 501c3, again, the most common, what we think of as a charitable organization, the 501c3 is exempt from income tax under the IRS. So an organization must be organized and operated exclusively for charitable purposes. And in this case, they may not in any way participate in or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to, again, the candidate for public office. So very important to know, they cannot get involved in politics in any way. And we'll talk about the specific way. Sometimes we fall into some traps or accidentally get involved in political campaigns when we're not aware that we are involved. So if it's a 501c3, absolutely no activity. So those C6s that we mentioned, like chambers of commerce, do have some allowances where they can get involved. There are certain levels and participation levels that they can get involved in politics or political campaigns. Sometimes you'll see some of them even set up PACs, political groups, for fundraising. And that is acceptable when you're 501c6. They'll set up a separate PAC for a particular campaign or candidate. Not going to go into a lot of the specifics about thresholds and amounts and those types of things for electioneering political intervention with C6s and C4s, but it essentially has to stay under 50% is the general rule. So 50% of all of their activities and all of their expenses or all of their programming can be, less than 50% can be on political activity. So same for C4. We talked about these just a little bit. The C4s have essentially the same regulations as a C6, but a little bit different in the sense of what their thresholds are. But that gives you the definition of kind of what some of those organizations look like. Okay, so let's talk specifically about the prohibited electioneering activities. And again, I'm not going to read all my slides to you, but I do want to talk about some of these in a little bit of detail. Publishing any printed statements and distributing any written statements at all. Or making any oral statements on behalf or in opposition to a candidate. So that you can see, I mean, that's pretty broad, and that's where we can get, especially with social media or things like that. So the gray area is where, how are we representing ourselves? If I am a board member of an organization, but I'm on my personal Facebook account or personal Snapchat, TikTok, whatever your choice of social media is, or, even if it's not social media, maybe your organization or your company's website, or maybe it's a sign in your yard. Where's that definition, that definitive line that's drawn between DJ as a personal constituent or supporter, just citizen, versus being a board member or an employee of a nonprofit. And that's where it gets a little bit gray. And that's where we have to be super careful to represent ourselves in one way or the other, and make sure that that nonprofit we're associated with isn't linked to any of our statements, and making sure that we're creating that divide or that veil kind of to protect the organization we're associated with. So in other words, if I have on my Facebook account, a part of my profile or my profile page says that I'm the current chairman of the board for Leadership Tulsa, then I probably don't need to be making political statements or support or opposition of anything like that, doing any kind of electioneering on my Facebook account. That would be a direct connection to a nonprofit organization that could get them in trouble just by being linked to me. So I have to be cognizant of that. So statements on the websites and links to websites are also very important to watch. Sometimes if we even put on our professional website for the nonprofit, maybe a link to, I'm trying to think of an example, but not necessarily a candidate's page, but maybe even an organization, maybe a business owned by a candidate. We have to be aware of all those little things that we're putting on there. And sometimes those are just completely by accident, especially in smaller communities. We don't always know, we don't always make that differentiation. We're used to supporting a business because they're a supporter of ours as a nonprofit. They give us money. And then all of a sudden the owner is running for state representative or mayor or something like that. And we don't even think to take that link off of our website. So we have to be pretty aware and always watching out for those things, especially, like I said, during political season. Right now, nobody's going to care as much, but during a heated season or a heated run, when things start kind of getting a lot more public, that's when people start caring. And it goes without saying that people care and are interested in what other people are saying a lot more than we used to be. We pay a lot more attention. And the reasons nonprofits have to be so careful, we're to stay out of this and be creative for the public good, no matter what, without influence from politics. And we need to always have that perception of being above board. But what happens is we become kind of an easy target during these heated times. So if someone wants to hurt another candidate, one of the easiest ways to do that is go after a nonprofit they're associated with, because everyone knows that nonprofits aren't supposed to be associated with specific candidates. And it's a really big red flag for the IRS. And so a lot of people will use us almost as weapons sometimes, unfortunately, when it gets stirred up. Yes.
Jay, a couple of interesting thoughts as you're talking. What about, and we see this quite a bit, at least in Tulsa, people who run nonprofits who are candidates for public office and retain their role running the nonprofit while they're candidates, and even after they're elected sometimes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if they're a 501c3, then that should not be happening. Just frankly, that's just a huge risk to that organization, because no matter what, there's always that perception that they're working or they're still involved in the nonprofit. So those board members need to be really aware of what's going on. If for some reason the board decides it is okay for that individual to run and there can be a separation made of some kind, I would definitely make sure it's a discussion of the full board and that it's voted upon and that you've got some public statements ready.
That makes a lot of sense. And that separation, making it very clear when we're speaking with one hat or the other. Another real life example. Adrian asks, follow on with that, also apply to board members of an organization who are running for office. And I've certainly had that happen on my board as well. People get interested in serving our community in different ways, and they may not be elected yet, but they run.
Right. Absolutely. And you can, again, it's just being aware. If I am a nonprofit 501c3, a lot of times, I'm always looking for the influential people or the people that can make sure and help me fundraise and get me into certain doors and things like that. So it's very easy to want to put some politicians or people that have been in office or are currently in office. And that's okay. If you want to put a current, judge or representative or something like that on your board, that's great if they're going to be able to help you. What you need to be careful of is when the election starts. So when they run for re-election, that's when they may want to take a step away from the organization. And that's usually what I recommend, is that they step down from their position as a board member and disassociate themselves as a decision maker. And that way you've created that space a little bit. You can always put them back on the board after they're reelected.
A real life example of this was back when I was running the Arts and Humanities Council, and we had a Carweldon Mansion at that time. And a candidate wanted to rent the facility for a campaign event. And so we got an opinion that either we'd be safe as just not having any campaign events, or if we did one, it would have to be any candidate at all could rent the space, and they all had to pay the regular going rate. There were no discounts. So I think that's kind of an interesting example of where that nonprofit and that election can become joined somehow, or give the perception. And I can't remember what we decided, probably that we wouldn't do any campaign events, if I know, risk aversion, that boards usually have.
Yeah. And so, one of the things that I always emphasize is some of us are guilty of, putting things on our website, or kind of things fall into the background that we forget are out there, especially if we have large organizations, large websites, or we don't have someone necessarily dedicated to updating it and watching it. But the thing to remember is, in the eyes of the IRS, of the public, of where the trouble is, a link on your website to a candidate's page, or something very direct like that, or that expresses opposition to someone else, is no different than running a television ad. It's the same thing. So we just have to be really careful, even though it's not as outward as we sometimes think of other attempts. So, kind of to your point, Wendy, I think, and we'll talk a little bit more about this too, is it's okay in some level to, for example, there's organizations that like to promote, if you go back to my first slide, we're promoting getting out to vote, or we're promoting certain things. If you want to have a candidate speak at an event, you can do that. That's okay. Or if a group wants to use maybe your facility as to host an event, not necessarily the candidate, but maybe it's a group that does do, a chamber or something like that, that's doing something on a candidate forum or something. Just make sure every candidate is invited and everything is equal. So, you can't, for example, give a candidate time on an agenda at one of your fundraisers to speak if it's during election. Now, keep in mind, if they're in office, this is a completely different discussion. But if it's during a campaign and they're running for election or re-election, giving them 10 minutes to speak as your keynote speaker or your guest speaker, and not providing that same opportunity to their opposition, to the people that are running against them, and every candidate that's running against them, is where you could get into trouble. So during the election, no candidates as keynote speakers, no candidates passing out paraphernalia at your events, nothing like that. If you give one the opportunity, you have to give every single one the opportunity. And that gets down to nitty gritty of communicating the invitation the same way, making sure they all get the same amount of reminder phone calls, the same amount of time on the agenda. They're standing in the same place wherever, where the majority of people attended. So you can't put one on the front of the agenda and one on the end. I mean, it gets really, really sticky. So just be super careful about that. And I just say, don't do it.
That's helpful context. Thank you.
You bet. So some more prohibitive activities, just distributing candidates' voting records without indication of support or opposition. So in other words, if I am, I have maybe a women's right, domestic violence organization, and I distribute candidates' voting records showing where they voted against all of our, we've always traditionally wanted passed, or, longer sentences for offenders, or whatever the legislation in the past was. If we don't we can't issue all of those voting records and try to be sly about it. In other words, when we know we're saying we don't like this guy. So don't try to get overly creative with how you're opposing or supporting someone. Surveys also presenting views of candidates on various issues. Be careful about that and how things are worded. Rating candidates using criteria, those types of things. It's just best to completely stay away from getting involved in candidate discussions at all. You don't want to come across as doing one thing or another, or trying to have kind of that subtle insinuation in there and somebody picks up on it. It's just best to stay away from those types of things. Of course, financial contributions are a no-no. Contributing to any particular candidate is absolutely prohibited on behalf of the nonprofit. So even in-kind contributions, such as letting them use your office, letting them use your meeting space or whatever it is to hold a rally, like I said, just stay completely away from those types of things. If for some reason you have a particularly great space that a lot of the public organizations or organizations use for public events, and this is going to be a space that needs to be utilized for things like this, just again, make sure every candidate is invited to utilize your space and at the same rate, the same price, the same amount of time, all of those types of things. So making it fair across the board. But during elections, I would say no political campaigns are allowed to use the facility. Distributing and questionnaires to candidates and showing any bias is also against regulations. So you can see how particular that it really gets in some of the prohibited activities. And I think I have a slide on this in a few minutes that we've all heard the phrase that perception is reality. And all it takes is for someone to just get a little bit of itch under their skin about you taking the wrong side, and there it comes. So just be careful. We talked about public forums and debates, candidate forums and things like that a lot of chambers and organizations might do. 501c3s particularly need to be very careful about conducting those if you decide to do that. Fundraising letters of any kind that show any bias, don't do that. Emails from staff or executive directors. And again, going into your board membership on the organization, if you're going to send something to people, letting them know, maybe everyone in your address book that you're for a particular candidate, or she's a friend of mine, or he's whatever the case is, don't put in the text as a board member of I see the work this person does every day. So don't advertise your affiliation and don't pronounce that as a part of that electioneering that you're doing on a personal level. There are definitely legal implications for charitable nonprofits if they get involved in electioneering or any kind of political activity. The charity could lose their tax exempt status through the IRS and is subject to excise tax as well. So just be very, very careful. Again, I think I feel like a broken record. Please be careful. Please be careful. One of those infomercials, do not do this. So lots of penalties, and it can be very costly financially as well to the organization, if not completely detrimental to the nonprofit mission of the organization. So what are some allowed electioneering activities? Like we've said, hosting public forums or debates where all of these qualifiers are in place. You've got all the qualified candidates are invited. Doesn't mean that they all agreed to participate, but you've got documentation that they've all been invited. and all invited the same way. Letter, phone call, email, whatever it was. The agenda covers a broad range of issues and questions. So you've got very nonpartisan type questions that are general, maybe about education, the economy, typical, questions that everyone can in some way be a part of or relate to in some capacity. You give them equal time. Always have a moderator that is, I recommend someone who's kind of experienced at this and understands legal implications, and that is a good moderator that can help you prepare the questions ahead of time, but also that can facilitate very well and moderate very well in case a candidate goes sideways. And the moderator is there to work on your behalf as a friend of your organization. Some more are just issuing summaries of voting records of incumbents, as long as you have these things that are identified on the statement that you're issuing or the email or whatever it is that you're putting out. Because remember, I said earlier, you can't just send something out that seems like it's super subtle, but you're trying to be kind of creative and sly about getting your message across. You want to make sure that all of these things are in place if you're going to do that. So it is acceptable. It can be done. You just have to be super vigilant about how you do it. And I will be happy to send my PowerPoint over if you need all of these specifics. So, or you can, take pictures or whatever, but don't feel like you have to write all this down or memorize it at this point. If you need it for later, I'm happy to share it with you.
So Dylan asks if there are any information about organizations that have been taxed or lost their nonprofit status due to electioneering.
Yeah, Google nonprofit electioneering. They're out there. There are some very specific stories. I try not to reference them. Just quickly, you live and learn. And I was doing a presentation one time years and years and years ago. And it was during a time when there was a very hot scandal going on nationally about a national organization. And the local affiliate happened to be in the room where I was speaking. I used it as a very general example of what kind of not to do. I didn't get into specifics. But man, did I make them mad. And so, they were trying to get it all to go away. And here I was talking about it and bringing it up by name. So I learned a long time ago not to use examples like that. It's just my personal choice. But there's definitely stories out there and newspaper articles and all kinds of information about specifics that have happened to organizations. It's going to be larger ones that are recognizable and are perceived to have quite a bit of power and influence, and are those that, again, people will see something and they think, okay, I'm going to go after them because I can, because they helped my opponent. So there's several larger organizations that has happened to. There are small ones too, though. We all know this from working in the nonprofit industry that, we're all kind of grouped together sometimes when bad things happen and when good things happen. And it just takes sometimes one person getting angry with the nonprofit sector to really just go after whoever's closely associated. And that is typically what you will read in these stories. It's not a blatant effort necessarily on behalf of the organization. So a lot of it is, if it's a smaller organization, they just didn't know. It was completely inadvertent and they didn't know they couldn't do it. So that's kind of my answer. I'm sorry that I can't necessarily be more specific, but there's lots of information out there if you just hit Google. So more allowed electioneering activities, are some voter education. registration projects, get out to vote type of efforts, providing a political science course by a college or university is acceptable, as long as they know that they can, participate in a political campaign, and it's not a course that's adjusted to a particular candidate. So just kind of thinking about some of the organizations that you're involved with, or that maybe you serve on a board of directors for, or maybe you have in the past. Think about if that organization participates in elections, or what their activities are if they do participate in elections. What kind of ways have you seen some things? Have you been following laws and guidelines and prohibited activities? Are they aware? Some of the biggest examples that we usually get that we have to kind of tone down are staff members bringing stuff and putting it on their desks at work when they work for a nonprofit, or sending emails on their email account or equipment that's owned by the nonprofit. Big no. And that's going to be true in lobbying as well. When we get into lobbying, that they are lobbying if they're utilizing the nonprofit's office space, even after hours, if they're using their office computer, even after hours, all kinds of things. And I can tell you, again, sometimes we just inadvertently get sucked into that. We don't even think about it as staff of nonprofits, especially. I have a working example of that. My younger daughter is in politics, and helped run a campaign for one of our Oklahoma Congress people. And she lives in Washington, D.C. now. But she was doing a lot of, they did a lot of calls and campaigns and different things, and she had to sign up volunteers. So of course, who does she ask first? She asked mom. I'm like, yeah, I'll help you out. I'll sign up for a shift. I did it after work hours. I did it from home, but I was using my work computer. I didn't even think about it. I have laptop that I transport back and forth. And I thought, well, I can do it on my iPad, but it's probably easier to do it on my work computer. So we just did it off of that. And about 10 minutes into it, I thought, oh no, I'm not supposed to be doing this. So I logged off real quick, and made sure that I kind of tried to undo what I had done. But it was completely innocent. I wasn't trying to get the nonprofit involved at all, but I was. So, and I'm supposed to be an expert in teaching this. So
that's a great reminder how easy it is to get sucked in. So I would love it if you have an example of a staff policy, because we don't have one. And the question does come up, and I certainly want individuals to be able to do things as individuals. But a great example is I once got asked if I would endorse a particular candidate who I was personally very supportive of. And luckily I had the good sense to say, no, I can't do that because of my position. Even if I didn't say, Wendy Thomas, as Executive Director of Leadership Tulsa, I think you're a great leader. Even I'm just so associated with the organization that it did not seem wise. And that candidate was incredibly understanding when I raised that issue. But
yes. And that's a great example, Wendy, because again, it's how do people identify you in the community? A lot of times, and we have to think about that. And, when I was an executive director, especially, and when I lived in a small town, or I was, the president of an organization, I would not put yard signs in my yard, because people knew I was the CEO of the chamber, or people knew I was the executive director of an organization, especially in a small community. But even here in Oklahoma City, I've done that as well. I just won't go there. And I have lots of friends that have been in office or in office now, run for office. Like I said, my daughter's in, the political realm. So I get asked a lot. I really do. And I'm very careful about those kinds of things, and was then, especially as a leader. So, okay. So just kind of give those things some thought. But yes, I do have an example of a policy And so I will send that to you, Wendy. I apologize. I probably should have had that available that I could have just dropped in the chat, but I didn't even think about that.
DJ, can I ask a question? This is Linda.
Yes, absolutely.
The balance between Facebook and LinkedIn. I'm used to using Facebook for my personal family, as you say, and I don't mention anything about being on a board of any organization in my Facebook profile. But LinkedIn is a different story. It has more of my affiliations and all. So if I'm posting, and I'm kind of out, I'll state my opinion pretty openly on Facebook, but not on LinkedIn. And yet, wouldn't take much for somebody to make the connection. So
Absolutely.
Is it really all off in terms of don't voice your opinion, as you point out, especially during an election period on Facebook, even if your profile doesn't connect you to that 501c3.
Yeah. So it's a judgment call. It really is. And a lot of it is just kind of taking a step back and saying, okay, how closely associated am I? Am I the founder and now I'm a board member? People may associate you more closely. Is it a small community? Is it, are you super involved in politics? I mean, you just really have to make that judgment call for yourself, because certainly as leaders in a community, you're going to get asked to support campaigns and do things and make donations and host parties and fundraisers and things like that a lot for candidates. And a lot of it's just going to have to be up to you and how comfortable you are disassociating yourself from the nonprofit at the time that you host the cocktail party, or that I'm on the board, but I'm rolling off this year, so I'm comfortable doing this, and nobody really, we're a large board or whatever. So just really, like us, asking yourself those questions and giving some thought to it. And the last thing you want to do as a leader and governing member of a board for an organization, you're obviously involved with them because you love what they do and you're passionate for the mission and you want them to be successful. The last thing you want to do is accidentally take them down or harm them in some way. So that's really the big thing is using your judgment and how it's going to affect the organization. And it's really that duty of care that you have as a governing board member or as a friend of the organization, how tightly wound that is. It's a great point, though. Okay,
there
so
are some. Excuse me, I'm sorry, one follow-up. There are also some areas that kind of blur the lines. It's not about a political campaign as much as it's a hot issue. Like more recently, it was Black Lives Matter, things like that can become very politically, oppositional. And so I guess even on those topics, we need to think twice.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's a whole nother training, but thank you for that comment, where it's not necessarily going to jeopardize your 501c3 status. It could definitely jeopardize some of your supporters and stakeholders, depending on where you are. And in those cases, I go back to, always, what are your core values of your organization? What does your board want to see for the organization? Don't do anything without them. What do your bylaws say? And where are you headed? Because if you don't stick to your core values and you just start throwing out statements left and right without consideration for your groups that you're going to affect, that could be bad too, especially when you've got super divisive things going on. Any other thoughts or questions on that? Let's talk about advocacy and lobbying just a little bit. Lobbying is an attempt to influence any legislation. So any piece of legislation that is out there, if you're trying to influence whether it gets approved or voted down, then that is lobbying. And that's the distinction that I always like to make very clear. When we get confused a lot sometimes between lobbying and advocacy. And then there's also direct lobbying and indirect lobbying, or some people call it grassroots lobbying. And so the distinction between lobbying and advocacy is that very thing. Lobbying is influencing legislation. So just kind of keep that in mind for clarity purposes. So it can mean that you're talking to legislators or a legislative body, you're going before a committee to influence them on how they vote for a piece of legislation. It could mean you're taking your local legislator to lunch. It can mean you're taking your local judge. However you're trying to influence that legislation. If you're getting involved in that, that's lobbying. So the other important piece of that, though, is that may be very, very much okay. There's also a misconception that nonprofits can't lobby, and especially 501c3s, that they cannot lobby. And that is absolutely not true. We got to get rid of that myth. Nonprofit organizations, 501c3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, all of them are allowed to lobby. Okay, there are just certain restrictions on how much they and how much money they can spend. It's actually a great deal that's allowed, and we're going to talk about how you measure that in just a second. But lobbying is absolutely allowed for nonprofit organizations. So I want to make sure that's very clear as well. So there's lots of ways to lobby. Nonprofits that want to stay within those boundaries will lobby a lot. And if you think about organizations like the one I just mentioned, in the case of like a YWCA or a domestic violence organization, will absolutely do lobbying to help their mission and their cause when it comes to certain pieces of legislation. You can hire a registered lobbyist. The Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits, we're 501c3, we have a lobbyist that we contract with. So that's a part of what we do, is lobbying and advocacy for other nonprofits. We have a lobbyist that we pay. You can work with coalitions. You can testify before the legislature, encourage regulatory changes. You can do lots of different things, written testimony, speaking before committees, urging the other people to go lobby and do grassroots lobbying is certainly allowed. Just like what we talked about with electioneering, there are some different limitations between different types of 501Cs. So it's important to understand those. We don't have a lot of time to go into all those differentiations this evening, but there are some different levels and different rules for other nonprofits other than 3s. So advocacy is just active and public support for a cause, idea, or policy. And you can think of this as just education for your organization, outreach, the advocacy efforts that you do on behalf of your mission is advocacy. And the efforts of picketing a store, for example, to stop selling something, that would be advocacy, because you're not trying to influence legislation, right? You're out in the community, you're sharing something that is related to mission and why it's important. So understanding that difference also. So advocacy is essentially public education about your cause or your issues that you have to do with your organization. So I mentioned that there is a measurement when we're talking about lobbying. So let's talk about that for just a second. When we lobby, again, it's an attempt to influence legislation. there are two tests that you can use, and we call those, the IRS calls those the expenditure test or the substantial part test. A best practice for all nonprofit organizations is to do that expenditure test. And the way we do that is we utilize the IRS form 501H. We call it a 501H election, and we use the expenditure test. And we actually put in and file with the IRS exactly how much we spent on lobbying. That's exactly what that is. That 501H form just reports to the IRS what we spent on lobbying. If we go with the other test, the substantial test, that's a whole different story. And what that means is that we're essentially leaving it up to the IRS to decide whether or not a substantial, quote unquote, substantial amount of our operation was used for lobbying. Any IRS agent that picks up your folder and has to make this determination is going to be subjective in their own opinion to decide if it was a substantial part. Again, they probably use certain guidelines, but we don't know. So it is definitely best practice and recommended to use that expenditure test. And if the organization does do lobbying, fill out that 501H form every year and use that with your tax return, with your 990, just file it. There's direct lobbying and indirect lobbying, like we talked about, direct lobbying, and there are some differences in the amounts you can do. So when you're reporting, it's important to know the differences. When we're talking about indirect and grassroots lobbying, it's a little bit more flexible, and it's a little bit easier to engage in without any levels of penalty or anything like that. But federal law does distinguish between the two. So you've got direct lobbying, which is it's the presentation of testimony at public hearings, legislative committees. It's that correspondence that you might send with legislators and staff. It's the phone calls that you might have with your legislators talking about trying to directly influence that legislation. Grassroots or indirect lobbying is more of trying to get other people involved in your cause. So it might be an appeal to the general public, or maybe segments of your constituents or your stakeholders that you ask to contact a legislator on behalf of this cause, for example. So you may send out an email saying, this piece of legislation is very important to our mission. Would you please contact Representative Bob to tell him not to vote for this? So that would be grassroots lobbying. You're kind of going through another channel to get to that legislation, if that makes sense. Here's a little chart that I did just that kind of shows you a little bit. Very simple terms. Advocacy, completely permitted, no penalties, no amounts, time limits, amount limits, anything like that. You're educating the public. Lobbying, again, is permitted. You're trying to change legislation or you're reacting to legislation. And then campaigning or electioneering, not permitted. And we talked, of course, extensively about that. So how do we make sure we don't fall into those pitfalls? Like I mentioned, sometimes it's inevitable and it just goes, right over our head in one ear and out the other, even when it's on the front of our mind and we should know better. So, you mentioned, I think it was Linda, you said, associating, you love saying what you think on Facebook, and I tell you, I'm not shy about it either, and people know where I stand. And talking politics is like getting arrested. Everything you say can and will be used against you at some point in time. We know that too. We take that risk, but we have to avoid that if we're going to be associated with the organization, with the nonprofit. And I think, you said it best, if our social media account can be linked to another one that does directly link us to an organization, maybe we need to be a little bit more careful. There's a quote that I love to, when you're talking about social media, we're all sometimes in that position, but I don't know how many of you, my parents always told me, it doesn't matter what they say, I'm always going to have the last word. And my husband knows that, my friends know that, my kids know that. If it's an argument or a discussion, I'm going to have the last word. And there's a quote that I love that says, make sure I get it right. It's, I will always get the last word. Anything you say after me is just a beginning of a new argument. So if you think you got the last word, no, you're just starting a new argument. And just remember that it's, I think we've probably all experienced that a lot on social media this past year. Sometimes it's an endless argument. We're not going to convince certain people of certain things. There's been a lot of defriending going on, and unfortunately, social media can be, my husband jokes, he's not a social media guy. I have a Facebook account. He calls it the devil's playground. So he hates it. So prepare, plan, and prevent. Perception is real. Remember, perception is reality. And Edward de Bono said, perception is real, even when it is not reality. And we know that, of course. We've all been through something that told us that. As leaders in the nonprofit sector, it's so important to remember, fair or not, you can and perhaps should reserve your political opinions to a very limited audience, and that may feel unfair. We've chosen to associate ourselves with this organization. Like I said earlier, we don't want to harm them. And we all have some strong opinions about certain things, but we're there to take care of that that organization at the time. The opposite can be true as well, that being completely open-minded and not having positions or deeply held beliefs can also be something to avoid during times like this. So it's important to be sensitive to and be aware of others' opinions, and that includes our constituents, our clients, other board members, our stakeholders, our funders. Those people ultimately are going to affect how successful we are. And so we have to be careful. Somebody told me, one of my mentors a long time ago, when I was having an issue, said, you have to be in control of the narrative. You have to control the narrative. If something, and that means you have to plan. You have to plan and prevent. So to be in control of the narrative, you have to be planning and preventing all the time. You have to be looking at your website, you have policies in place. You have to have public statements prepared or know who's going to make those statements if there's something that's controversial out there that could affect you. So control your own narrative, control the narrative for the organization. Always go back to your mission when you're thinking about how you're going to take a stance on something as an organization. It's about your mission. And talk about the problem you're trying to solve and why you were there to begin with. Define the impact that it's going to have on your organization, or what no response would have, on the impact of the organization. So there's just a few tips for controlling your narrative. Always be specific. Don't over-explain. I'm the worst at that. I over-explain a lot. Wendy, I think you mentioned the standards for excellence, and we've talked about standards for excellence, but there's certainly certain benchmarks in there. And if you're not familiar with standards for excellence, it's an ethics and accountability code for nonprofits. And it talks about what best practices are, goes pretty deep into best practices for organizations.
So Adrian in the chat had such an important question, and one that I think is nuanced, because we can become frightened to ever speak our mind or speak out about our organization. And she says, if my organization's cause comes up at a personal networking event, how do I talk about it? And then when do I need to report that? And we want our board members to be advocates for our organizations out in their personal networks. Do you have any advice in addition to what I put in the chat thread for her?
Yeah, so, and that's a great question. And it goes back to just, there's so much gray area, and we bleed over so easily from organization's cause and being a great advocate and ambassador for that cause and for the organization into something that can be super divisive, and then something that can be political. So, you know, if we're talking about advocacy and lobbying, again, you don't need to worry about the lobbying thing necessarily, especially as a volunteer. Diving into those decisive or those divisive discussions, though, you have to just step lightly. You know, being an advocate for your mission and being argumentative or adversarial, there should be a line in between. And so I know, you know, again, my personality, that's very, very difficult for me, because I don't make quick judgments or decisions about how I feel about certain issues. I educate, I research, I listen to other people, I hear both sides. So when I do decide, I'm super passionate about it, and there's not much moving me off of it. And if I think you're wrong, I'm going to have that last word, and I'm going to tell you all of the reasons I've learned why I think it's wrong. And I try.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's really important too that it's the electioneering piece, speaking for or against one candidate or another, or one party or another. That's what's prohibited in the nonprofits. So
Right.
Everything you're talking about is about good judgment,
right,
and representing your organization well, but it's not going to get you in trouble with the IRS.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it goes just back to thinking about what's best for the organization and using your judgment. Wendy, I know we're a little bit over time. Can I have just like 2 more minutes to wrap this up, and then we can do as much discussion as everybody wants to stick around for. Is that okay with you? Okay.
Sorry, I
okay.
talked so much.
No. It's a great discussion. And this started out as a 3-hour course, and I tried to make it into an hour for tonight. So I wasn't sure how it would go, but it's good information. But I'll jump through these last few pieces. And like I said, I'm happy to answer any questions, even offline later. So, okay. So have a plan, always have your plan. And that includes, media relations and policies and procedures for how you're going to deal with lobbying, electioneering, those types of things. And my best advice, just to go to some of the questions we've had, is train your board on how you want them to respond to certain things. Have an objections clinic. If you're in an area that people are going to want to know your stance on certain things, and these discussions come up, then prepare your board members for it. Don't let them be surprised by it. Same with influential donors too, by the way. So have accurate and timely documents, your annual report, those things you fall back on as the way you do business, and that show your high level of transparency are important in these cases. You'll be able to show your last 990 where you reported your lobbying activities, and helping them understand what your policies are for not getting involved in electioneering, which I'll share a policy for you, so you'll have that. So having policies on all these things, I just said that. Media and public relations too. It's so easy for us to get caught off guard with the media, and the first one that gets the call usually responds, or they freeze up and they don't respond. So that can be a big thing there too. And then have your position statements. I mentioned these a little bit earlier. Standards for Excellence gives us great advice about having board approved policies on advocacy and what our position statements are going to be, so that we can say those things and feel confident and comfortable about influencing the public or our friend groups or public groups that we're in without harming the organization. So having some things prepared and training those people that might be asked to speak on behalf of your organization are really important to have. Okay. Avoiding political partnerships, those types of things, so important. They can be there when we don't recognize them. We've mentioned that. The last few slides I had for you were just kind of fun quizzes if we had time. So I'll skip over those and stop sharing my screen so we can talk.
So maybe since we're over time, if you would put your email address in the chat.
Yeah.
And then if anyone does have any question that we can't get to, because sometimes they get so specific.
They do.
And
yeah.
Yeah,
I will talk
really
through
deep topic. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm happy to talk through any specific situation that you might have. We can schedule a call or, talk about it for sure if you're unsure or not that's happening. So I know it was it went by a lot quicker than I thought, but like I said, this is usually a 3-hour class. Yeah. I apologize that it was like a speed read, but thank you for the sweet comments.
No, it was incredible information, and I know for a fact that I'm going to send it to at least a couple of organizations that I've worked with where these sorts of questions have come up. So I thought it was very helpful indeed. So I'm just going to thank you for your time as opposed to taking Q&A. And I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, and we'll see you again in a couple of months for our next Board Skill Up.
Thank you for the opportunity, Wendy. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.